The United Kingdom has announced one of its most significant asylum policy changes in decades, confirming that refugee status will no longer be granted on a permanent basis and will instead become a temporary protection arrangement. The announcement was made by Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood during an address recorded in the parliamentary estate, outlining a major restructuring of the country's approach to international protection and long-term settlement. According to the Home Secretary, the UK will now issue refugee status for a period of 2.5 years, replacing the current 5-year system. The change forms part of a wider government effort aimed at deterring irregular migration, particularly the continued attempts by asylum seekers to cross the English Channel from France in small boats. The government has repeatedly stated that these crossings present safety risks, place significant pressure on the asylum system, and empower criminal smuggling networks. Mahmood described the new framework as necessary, referencing policy movements across Europe where governments have been tightening asylum rules in response to political, social and security concerns. In making her announcement, she delivered a statement lasting just over 30 seconds, in which she confirmed the revised duration of refugee protection and introduced a new requirement that long-term settlement be possible only after 2 decades of residence. In the recorded parliamentary session, Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood stated the following: "In recent years, asylum applications have reached their lowest level in 40 years, editor's note, in Denmark, and now across Europe, countries are strengthening their systems in a similar way. We must act as well. We will do so by making refugee status temporary, not permanent. Refugee status will be granted for 2.5 years, not 5, and will only be renewed if it is impossible for a refugee to return home. Permanent settlement will now be possible after 20 years, not 5. This quote, delivered in full, marks the first time the Home Secretary has publicly confirmed the government's intention to dramatically extend the timeline for permanent settlement. Under the previous framework, individuals who were granted refugee status could apply for indefinite leave to remain after 5 years. The new policy multiplies that timeline by 4, setting a 20-year requirement before any application for permanent settlement can be made. The shift is described by the government as part of a broader policy overhaul. Officials argue that the previous system did not sufficiently discourage dangerous and irregular entry routes into the United Kingdom, particularly those used by small boat migrants. The government maintains that temporary protection will ensure individuals receive safety when needed, but will no longer assume that long-term residence is guaranteed unless return to their country of origin remains impossible for an extended period of time. The Home Office has frequently emphasised that the asylum system must adapt to new patterns of migration, which they say have changed substantially over recent years. The increase in small boat arrivals has been one of the most visible manifestations of this shift, prompting debates in Parliament, public discussions about the capacity of the asylum system, and pressure on local authorities responsible for housing and support services. Ministers have repeatedly argued that criminal networks have exploited structural weaknesses in the system. By maintaining a route to permanent settlement after only 5 years, the government says the previous model incentivised attempts to reach the UK by irregular means. The Home Secretary's policy announcement forms part of a wider set of measures intended to tighten the criteria for protection and align the UK's procedures with those adopted by several European neighbours. Although Mahmood referenced the decline in asylum applications, the official note clarifies that the figure cited, lowest level in 40 years, refers to Denmark, not the United Kingdom. This clarification reflects the editorial note included in the raw document, ensuring that the context of the statement is accurately represented. Despite that distinction, the Home Secretary used the example to illustrate a broader trend in how European governments are reacting to migration pressures. The decision to limit refugee status to 2.5 years also represents an attempt to establish more regular periodic reviews of protection needs. Government officials argue that an initial 30-month period allows sufficient time to determine whether conditions in a refugee's home country have stabilised. If government assessments conclude that return remains unsafe or not feasible, temporary protection may be extended. Otherwise, the individual may be required to return once the period ends. Under the revised plan, the test for renewal will be based strictly on whether it remains impossible for the person to return home safely. This requirement is clearer and narrower than the previous eligibility standards, which allowed refugees to transition from temporary to permanent protection more quickly and with fewer constraints. This tightening represents a deliberate effort to redefine the purpose of refugee status as a form of temporary sanctuary rather than a pathway to long-term integration. Mahmood made clear that the United Kingdom is acting in parallel with developments across Europe, where several governments, confronted with rising political debate surrounding asylum, resettlement and border security, are implementing reforms that similarly prioritise temporary protection. The Home Secretary emphasised that the UK must adjust its policies to remain consistent with international patterns and maintain what she described as a sustainable, secure asylum framework. The policy change has been formally attributed to the government's goal of discouraging channel crossings. The Home Office has regularly stated that temporary protection, combined with stricter review processes, will reduce the incentives for individuals to undertake dangerous journeys, while critics argue that the changes may increase uncertainty and prolong instability for refugees already residing in the UK. The government maintains that the long-term objective is to protect lives by reducing irregular arrivals. As part of its broader strategy, the UK continues to strengthen cooperation with France and other European partners to increase patrols, share intelligence, and prevent attempted crossings. The collaboration includes measures aimed at identifying smuggling routes, deterring criminal groups behind the crossings, and improving early warning systems for maritime movements in the Channel. The Home Secretary's announcement is therefore one component of a wider operational framework stretching across borders and agencies. The requirement for 20 years before obtaining permanent settlement marks one of the most consequential aspects of the policy overhaul. The extension represents a significant recalibration of the UK's long-established integration model, which previously provided migrants who secured refugee protection with a clearer, faster path to long-term stability. Under the new system, refugees will reside in a continuous cycle of temporary status renewals unless conditions in their home country permanently preclude return. This longer timeline also means that individuals may spend 2 decades undergoing periodic assessments, each requiring evidence that return remains unsafe. Government officials argue that this periodic review is essential to ensure the system remains focused on protection rather than long-term migration planning. The Home Secretary has indicated that this approach allows the UK to remain aligned with its international obligations while ensuring that permanent settlement is granted only when strictly justified. The decision comes at a time of heightened public attention on migration issues, particularly in relation to the Channel. Small boat arrivals have been a persistent challenge for successive UK administrations, prompting policy proposals ranging from international partnerships to legal reforms. The new asylum rules are positioned by ministers as part of a unified response intended to reinforce border controls and reshape the incentives surrounding irregular migration. In delivering her announcement, Mahmood reiterated the government's position in clear terms. We must act too. We will do so by making refugee status temporary, not permanent. This line, repeated during her address, underscores the central theme of the policy shift. The government is framing the asylum changes as essential to ensure the long-term sustainability of the system, manage pressures on public services, and discourage dangerous migration routes. As the UK implements these reforms, the long-term effects will be monitored closely by policymakers, local authorities, and organisations involved in refugee support. The new framework marks a structural transformation of the UK's approach to international protection, placing an unprecedented emphasis on temporary status, periodic reassessment, and delayed settlement. The government's position is clear. The United Kingdom will provide protection where required, but permanent settlement will now follow a far longer and more restricted process. The new policy is now set to form the basis of the UK's asylum framework going forward, with the Home Secretary confirming that the system will prioritise temporary protection and extended eligibility timelines as core components of national policy. The UK now moves ahead with a restructured asylum system built around temporary refugee status, periodic review, and a 20-year timeline for permanent settlement.